Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon if you're in the United States, or even good morning if you're on the other side of the planet. And I know some of our listeners hail from far across the world. I'm Alex Mikaberidze. I'm one of the hosts of this symposium, along with my wonderful colleague, Beatrice de Graaf, who is joining us from Netherlands. We had a wonderful day of presentations, right, Beatrice? And what can be a better way to end today's discussions than to have a keynote talk by an eminent historian. Now, before I introduce her, I do want to thank all the participants, all the presenters. I want to thank Beatrice for managing the symposium behind the scenes, to Dr. Sluga for chairing the panel, of course our great group of presenters for preparing their talks, and of course the audience for sticking so late. I know it's over after 9 o'clock in Europe, so for staying with us so late, and I hope you will join us for tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll have a whole day of discussions and presentations, which will be, I think, very, very interesting. Today, I want to introduce our keynote speaker. And before I do so, I want to express my deep gratitude to Dr. Elise Wirtschafter, because she attended the panels, she listened to papers, and she agreed to deliver the keynote address despite very difficult time for her family. And I want to convey my sincerest condolences to Dr. Wirtschafter on the passing of her father. These are very challenging times for your family, and my thoughts and with you. So, and I especially appreciate you being with us at this moment and kind of showing your professionalism in delivering the keynote address, despite the emotional stress of the loss of the parent. Dr. Wirtschafter is Emeritus Professor of History at California State Polytechnic University. Anyone who has any kind of brush with 18th, 19th century Russian history knows her. So in that sense, she needs no introduction to Russian specialists. Especially, I've read her work with great delight for many years. Her publications include numerous books such as Religion and Enlightenment in Catherinean Russia, Russia's Age of Serfdom, The Play of Ideas in Russian Enlightenment and Theater, Social Identity in Imperial Russia, and probably my favorite one is From Serf to Russian Soldier. Her latest work is entitled From Victory to Peace, Russian Diplomacy After Napoleon, which was published recently by Cornell University Press. And today, Dr. Wirtschafter will give a Friday keynote address on the Russian political culture in the aftermath of Napoleonic defeat. Dr. Wirtschafter, the floor is yours.
Do I start? Okay, thank you. So, Alex, do I need to share screen again? Because I'm...
Yes, you will have to share it again.
Okay, there we go. And then I've got my arrow. Okay, great, thank you. So actually, I'm framing my presentation today in terms of Russia's relationship to Europe, and the subject of this conference, the emergence of a new international security system in the post-Napoleonic era, is one that imagines a Russia fully integrated into European society and politics. This is certainly how Emperor Alexander I and his diplomatic agents understood their role in the peacemaking that followed the victory over Napoleon. More broadly, the empire's subjects and intimates saw in their monarch, who had spearheaded the Allied coalition that defeated Napoleon in 1813 and 14, They saw in him nothing less than the divinely anointed savior of Europe. Present day European historiography, I think, accords to Emperor Alexander and to Russia their rightful places, their rightful significance in the victory over Napoleon and in the reconstruction of Europe that followed. For historians of Russia, who always are aspiring to be part of European history, however, conceptual problems remain. With respect to Restoration Europe, the categories of analysis that emerge from European sources do not always fit the Russian experience. However, from the perspective of security culture, historical experience would beg us to consider how to integrate Russia into the European system. So actually, even in light, although given the current situation, I truly believe that I understand very little about Russia and that we all need to stop and rethink themes and analyses that we've been making for my entire professional career. But in fact, I don't think I would change the title of this topic, this presentation, in light of the current situation. So although not yet part of my concrete research, I have long wanted to understand how Russia ended up on the political and psychological periphery of Europe, especially considering the Enlightenment convergences of the 18th and early 19th centuries. I think the peacemaking after the victory over Napoleon offers a good starting place for understanding this Russian divergence or parting of ways, because this is the moment when Russia was most integrated into European society and the European political system. From the reign of Tsar Peter I, let's see, maybe I need to go past this. Okay, from the reign of Tsar Peter I, known as the Great, until the second quarter of the 19th century, the Russian monarchy and governing classes appeared united in the assumption that the power of the Russian state, the security of the Russian people, including the imperial peoples, and the progress of Russian society and culture depended on Europeanization. And this was a process defined by the importation and adaptation of European technology, cultural models, forms of sociability, and Enlightenment ideas. Even after Romantic nationalists began to extol the virtues of Russian exceptionalism and question the benefits of European modernity, the monarchy and educated service classes continued to see themselves as members of European society. Russia's historical and cultural ties to Greek civilization and Christianity, which dated back to the medieval origins of the Muscovite state, provided a firm basis for the self-conscious European identity of Russian elites. Ironically, it was the Greek question that first exposed the unwillingness of the Allies to act in concert with Russia to defend the empire's treaty rights vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire. And obviously this is the Russian point of view. The ongoing conflict associated with the Eastern question would lead to the Crimean War, which from the Russian perspective represented the end of the Great Alliance or the Grand Alliance. So before I discuss the post-Napoleonic security order, I would like to highlight some specificities of the Russian experience and the Russian context. So starting with environmental and socioeconomic factors, the colossal burden of fighting for or against Napoleon weighed upon all the states of Europe, as each faced particular vulnerabilities and challenges. For Russia, the need to compete in the European theater and sustain the war effort against Napoleon required the mobilization and maintenance of a regular standing army. The creation of Russia's what I've called semi-standing army and a society and economy built on serfdom and communal peasant farming dated back to the reforms of Peter the Great. It's noteworthy that decades before the appearance of revolutionary France's citizen army, Russia developed a system of mass conscription based on the institution of serfdom. There would be no significant reform of this system until 1874. At the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the term of service for Russia's peasant soldiers stood at 25 years. Equally noteworthy were the geostrategic challenges posed by Russia's size, primitive communications, extensive landlocked borders, lack of natural barriers, and limited access to the sea. Okay, turning now to institutional factors. The Napoleonic Wars highlighted the strength and continued meaningfulness of Russia's old regime institutions, affirmed by their ability to prevent the destruction of the Russian state and society in 1812 and 13. The reform of legal administrative institutions, including an increasingly professionalized central bureaucracy, had been central to Russian state building since the early 18th century. The process continued through the reign of Alexander I and beyond, arguably until the end of the old regime in 1917. Enlightened state-sponsored reform and cultural development did not change course in response to the modernizing transformations associated with the French Revolution and Napoleonic Empire. The creation of state schools and the court's lavish spending, lavish support for letters, arts, and sciences represented enduring policies that also had begun in the reign of Peter the Great. Only after Russia's humiliating performance in the Crimean War would institutions such as serfdom be fundamentally reformed. Okay, I forgot that slide. I'll stay there for 1 second. Reform at the apex of the political system would not occur until after the Revolution of 1905. Though there would be repeated high-level considerations of political reform along the way and increasingly demands for political change from the educated classes. So these next slides just were designed to illustrate the physical burden of conscription on Russian society. And I'm not sure you can see the quote here because of the Zoom squares. So in other words, in brief, the Napoleonic era and the years of peacemaking that followed strengthened the Russian monarchy's legal administrative approach to social and political change. Both the Romanov Tsardom and the Russian Orthodox Church emerged from the crisis as strong and legitimate as ever. The Napoleonic invasion failed to unleash popular revolt or widespread support for political change. To the contrary, the strength and stability of established institutions during a quarter century of revolution and war reinforced and justified longstanding practices of enlightened reform, moderate censorship, and severe punishment of rebellion against legitimate monarchical, hierarchical, and religious authority. So there would be increasing demands from the educated classes for political change. There would be what's described as Russia's first modern political opposition in the Decembrist Rebellion of 1825. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So next factor I wanted to mention is the religious factor, particularly the continuing strength of the Russian Orthodox Church or the Orthodox religion, the broad-based belief in divine providence, and the religious experience, sometimes referred to as the mysticism of Alexander I. All of these factors found expression in Russia's post-Napoleonic foreign policy. Religious belief became a source of strength for the Tsar. All right, I've also been here. Okay. And from the perspective of Russian policymakers, the Holy Alliance represented the moral glue that held together the legal peace. So I will come back to the Holy Alliance. But I just want to say here that diplomatic references to divine providence were not mere rhetorical flourishes. They were expressions of deeply held beliefs and ways of understanding the world. All right, the political factors then. I guess I can go back to this. Yes, okay. Here I would like to highlight the inadequacy, and this is an issue that's come up in several papers, even the irrelevance of the political labels, the various isms that tend to inform the European historiography of the Restoration era. As I mentioned, in Russia, there was no open opposition to absolutist monarchy or to establish political arrangements before the Decembrist Rebellion of 1825, a rebellion that found no echoes in the general population. So if we are going to think in terms of a post-Napoleonic system for the management of European security, and I like the formulation, management of European security, which I think I took from Beatrice's book, then my question would be, how can the Russian conception of political authority, which was monarchical, hierarchical, and personalized, be incorporated? How does the broader question of legitimate sovereignty, which I don't think I've heard the principle of legitimacy mentioned much in what I've heard so far, how does that fit into the model? Did the security culture constitute a system or a commitment to implement treaty relationships and manage divergent expectations? In the Russian case, one can speak of legal and moral principles, mutual expectations, which repeatedly would be disappointed, and personalized relationships articulated in the sentimentalist language of friendship among the sovereigns. With respect to formal law, it would have been impossible to consider the subordination of Russian political authority to any institution or transnational entity. There were no formal or legal limits on the power of the Tsar, no ancient feudal rights or constituted bodies. The divinely anointed monarch was bound to obey the law, but he or she also could change the law at will in the process of rendering any decision or judgment. So as Russian historians point out, this was not despotism, but rather the rule of laws in the plural. Although a substantial corpus of church writings and later literary works affirm the right of subjects to reject a bad king, in principle, the monarch answered only to God. Now, the right to remove an unjust ruler, which, as everyone knows, I'm sure goes back to biblical sources, segues into another aspect of Russian political culture that is important for understanding European security after Napoleon. And that is the continuing appeal of 18th century practices of enlightened reformism. Here I refer to ideas of good governance, state-directed social and cultural progress, and the moral perfectibility or self-reformation of the individual human beings who exercised authority. All right, so next I want to turn to the critical interests that defined Russian foreign policy after the victory over Napoleon. So first is Allied, especially Austrian and British distrust of Russia's intentions. Distrust among the Allies was exemplified first initially by the secret defensive alliance of January 3rd, 1815, concluded by Austria, Britain, and France in connection with the Polish-Saxon controversy and directed against Prussia and Russia. And here I would add, even if one acknowledges Russia's security concerns, and of course that's a big question for today, and in general, a big question that I think fits into this security culture framework, we still have to consider the facts of Russian imperial expansion that were taking place during this time. And I would just mention here Poland, Georgia, Finland, and Bessarabia, all starting in 1772 and continuing through to 1812. The second critical interest was the violations of established treaty obligations by the Ottoman Empire, again, at least from the Russian point of view. Here, one must consider Russian access to the Black Sea and Straits, Russia's self-proclaimed role as protector of Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule, the ambiguous status of the Danubian principalities within the Ottoman Empire, and the aspirations of Baltic peoples for autonomy or even independence, peoples such as the Serbs and later the Greeks. Third critical interest was shared by all the allies, the interest in protecting Europe from the perils of war and revolution. This interest, this goal encompassed the commitment to act in concert against any power that disturbed the equilibrium or threatened the territorial integrity of another state. Equally significant was the problem of social stability, embodied in the policy of suppressing revolution and encouraging enlightened reform. Last critical interest I want to mention is and there have been allusions to this in some of the discussion and papers, Russia's preference for a system, at least initially, that elevated the inclusive general alliance over what was seen initially as the exclusive quadruple alliance. This interest touched on how best to manage divergent interpretations of recognized treaties. The legality of intervention, the use of moral or military means of intervention, and the question of whether concerted action represented the fulfillment of recognized treaty obligations or the formation of some sort of separate alliance. Overshadowing these concrete interests that define Russian policy and the larger question of peace in Europe So overshadowing these concrete interests was the larger question of peace in Europe. How did Alexander I and his diplomatic agents think that Russia and the Allies could preserve the peace? To address this question, I'd like to highlight 3 dimensions of Russian diplomatic thought: the legal settlement, the moral settlement, and the concept of political change. Let's see, sorry. Now I've lost my, there it is, sorry, thank you. Okay. So the legal settlement encompassed the question of Allied unity and the commitment to act in concert, to concerter. Across Europe, the desire for tranquility arose from the vicious warfare and broken alliances of the Napoleonic era. The longing for peace and the belief that peace required alliance unity helped to explain the idealism, pragmatism, compromise, and consistency of Emperor Alexander's foreign policy. The historian can only wonder at the ability of the peacemakers, however short-sighted some of their decisions may have been, to sustain the hard work of seeking reconciliation, collective security, and enduring peace. If the goal of the European political system was to preserve the peace and security, the mechanism for realizing that goal from the Russian point of view was the commitment to act in concert. This meant that no great power would conclude a separate agreement with any other great power or with a second order power in a situation that affected the general security of Europe. The coalition politics of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars underscored the necessity of this principle. Repeatedly, alliances had been formed and understandings reached only to evaporate due to military losses and separate agreements with Napoleon. By contrast, the military campaigns of 1813 and 1814 revealed that military effectiveness could be sustained if the Allies remained united. This was the basis for Alexander I's fidelity to legality and collective action. As events on the ground would prove, preservation of the equilibrium required that Europe's diplomats continually reconstruct the peace through negotiation, state building, military mobilization, and above all, the obligation to act in concert. The role of the alliance whether the Quadruple Alliance, the Grand Alliance of the Five Great Powers, the General Alliance of European States, or the Holy Alliance, was to ensure adherence to the European public law enshrined in the treaties of Paris, the final act of the Congress of Vienna, and the protocols of Aix-la-Chapelle. Russia's diplomats recognized the oligarchic tendency in the European system and the potential volatility of public opinion. However, they also assumed that the intimate union of the four great courts plus France would be able to maintain an equilibrium between states and between governments and public opinion. If the great powers acted with moderation and benevolence, Russia's diplomats proclaimed, all the states of Europe would understand that the European system was not the work of any single power. To the contrary, all the powers contributed equally to its conservation, and all shared the sentiment that identified duty with interest. For Russia, legality meant strict adherence to both the letter and the spirit of the treaties that defined the peace, a formulation that could open the door to conflicting interpretations of treaty obligations. Although this formulation was consistent with legislative practices in the Russian Empire, the concern for outcomes that embodied the spirit of the law sometimes pushed the expectations of Russia's diplomats beyond what other great powers would accept. References to reciprocal trust hinted at another critical aspect of Allied unity: sentiments of friendship and intimate union among the sovereigns. From the perspective of the 21st century, statements about the political efficacy of personal bonds and feelings can seem contrived and cynical. Even for historians such as myself, who are inclined to accept official pronouncements as sincere statements of intent, one must ask how the peacemakers imagined that the bonds of friendship would be perpetuated once they passed from the scene. The monarchies of old regime Europe all practiced some form of personalized politics grounded in Christian morality and patriarchal family relations. In the era of rebuilding, where the sentimentalist language of the late Enlightenment and early Romanticism held sway, effective ties of friendship represented a means to transcend the reality of great power domination. The language of friendship among the sovereigns sustained the peacemakers' narrative of independent states participating equally in the benefits and responsibilities of the alliance. After the consolidation of alliance unity in 1818, events in Europe began to test the Allies' conception of how to preserve the peace. In Russian sources dating from 1815 to 1823, the moral force of Allied unity remained a key concept in discussions of what it meant to act in concert. The sources identified three grounds for collective Allied action: legal obligation, the authority of historical experience, and moral principles. In the conferences of Aix-la-Chapelle, Troppau, Laibach, and Verona, and in response to revolutions in Spain, Italy, and Greece, Russia's initial proposals invariably stressed the need for a unified Allied response. Allied unity constituted the great moral force that could preserve the peace and, if necessary, legitimize and guarantee success in war. Britain's reluctance to engage in foreign interventions did not pose a serious problem, precisely because the lack of engagement did not imply the formation of separate alliances of the old type that had allowed Napoleon to dominate Europe, to subjugate Europe. Governments existed under different regimes and could not always be united in their actions, but moral solidarity among the great powers could be maintained. Thus, the Allies needed to show the public that there were no differences in their fundamental principles and unanimous wishes. In these formulations, one can see how Emperor Alexander's foreign policy, like his domestic programs, moved uncomfortably between religious idealism, aspirational liberalism, practical possibilities, and the heavy-handed exercise of absolutist political power. On the level of concrete experience, Russia's policy positions, proposals for collective guarantees, and proclamations of eternal principles adhered to the two pillars of the post-Napoleonic legal settlement: collective guarantee of territorial boundaries and the inviolability of legitimate sovereignty, the latter understood as legally constituted authority. Like the enlightened reformism of the 18th century, the Congress system of 1815 to 23 gave modern meaning to a set of political principles that allowed change in the present without radical rejection of the past. So again, my research at this point is limited to the reign of Alexander and really ends with the 1823 decisions about intervention in Spain. Okay, let's see if I can. All right, so turning to the moral settlement and the Holy Alliance Treaty of 1426 September. Actually, the treaties usually referred to as the Treaty of 1426 September 1815 without the label Holy Alliance. Russia's peacemakers invariably claim to conduct foreign policy based on legal treaty prescriptions. But Russia was not a rule of law state, even though the monarchy governed through laws. So as before, it's important to stress this rule of laws as opposed to the rule of law. The legal settlement of 1814, 1815, and 1819, from Alexander's point of view, from the point of view of Russian foreign policy, seemed insufficient to preserve European peace. A moral settlement also was needed, and it was the Holy Alliance that provided the moral glue for the legal arrangements. Thus, peace in Europe depended on, quote, the empire of Christian morality and the law of nations, end quote. Similarly, the Holy Alliance recognized God's rights over human societies and guaranteed inviolable rights to sovereigns and peoples by imposing on them the reciprocal duties of conscience and Christian family. In other words, among the peoples that made up, quote, the great European family, political legislation should emanate from the precepts of divine law. The lofty emotional rhetoric of the Holy Alliance Treaty helps to explain the characterization of Alexander I and his foreign policy as abstract, idealistic, erratic, and insincere. Indeed, the language of the Holy Alliance Treaty can sound empty or even threatening to non-Russian ears. Eternal principles, harmonious universality, and ideals of family and friendships, these concepts expressed Christian morality, enlightened cosmopolitanism, which was mentioned earlier today, and the sentimentalist empathy characteristic of Russia's 18th century Enlightenment. For historians of late 18th and early 19th century Russia, the language of the treaty is consistent with countless legislative acts, official proclamations, and semi-official literary and journalistic compositions. In the Russian context, the Holy Alliance Treaty dovetailed with Enlightenment conceptions of good governance and cultural progress, which maybe fits in with this discussion of civilization that's come up during this conference. The religious teachings about the oneness of church and monarchy, human and providential history, and God's sovereignty over the Christian peoples had long been pillars of Russian political thought. Russian descriptions of the Holy Alliance also highlighted the impact of a new moral spirit visible across Europe that placed the general interest in peace above the particular interest of territorial states and separate combinations. And this moral spirit was something that numerous documents referred to and described. Treaties and accords were essential for peace, but they represented particular interests and therefore ran the risk of leading states into the old political relationships and separate combinations. So I think this is a very important formulation when we're trying to understand the Russian point of view. Without Christian morality and spiritual regeneration, the degradations caused by more than 2 decades of destructive warfare could not be overcome and peace could not be preserved. Only the fulfillment of humanity's duties to God could secure the peace. To that end, the signatories to the treaty, to the Holy Alliance Treaty, promised to rule their states and organize their relations with other governments in accordance with God's commandments and with the divine precepts of love, truth, and peace. They would act as fathers to their subjects, govern in the spirit of brotherhood, and view their fellow sovereigns as countrymen or compatriots. In other words, the regenerated moral spirit based on eternal Christian principles would preserve Allied unity and ensure European peace. For Emperor Alexander and his diplomatic agents, the act of fraternal Christian alliance embodied the spirit of the European peace, the hand of God in human history, and the role of monarchs as instruments of divine providence. As the monarch wrote in 1812, quote, "In moments such as those in which we find ourselves, I believe that even the most hardened person feels a return toward his creator. I surrender myself to this feeling, which is so habitual for me, and I do so with a warmth and abandon much greater than in the past. I find there my only consolation, my sole support. It is this sentiment that sustains me." The Holy Alliance Treaty connected the European alliance to a renewed moral spirit based on Christian fraternity that would ensure the peace. Neither, in my view, the product of religious mysticism nor the cornerstone of a reactionary restoration, the Holy Alliance can be described as the means to implement a large-scale policy or system grounded in the religious and Enlightenment ideal of a harmonious, interlocking universe. Diplomatic communications designed to persuade sovereigns to join the alliance and also to counter allegedly erroneous interpretations of the treaty suggest that Russian policymakers sought to establish a mechanism for regulating and maintaining the peace. The application of eternal principles to the civic and political relations of states, principles of peace, harmony, and love that already were recognized in the sphere of individual and family relations, would establish friendship among rulers on an indissoluble foundation independent of accidental causes. Okay. Third concept that I want to discuss here before I turn to my conclusion is legitimacy and the principle of legitimacy and political change. From the outset of the peacemaking process, the Allies recognized that individual states lived under different constitutions, and we've had discussion of constitutions and what that all meant today. Although it was necessary that governments be legitimate and exercise legal authority, the legitimist principle did not require that they be purely monarchist, nor were changes to establish constitutions illegitimate, as long as these changes occurred by legal means instead of violent or revolutionary action. Sovereignty and legitimacy played complementary roles in post-Napoleonic diplomatic discussions. Sovereignty denoted respect for the independence and territorial integrity of all states, large and small, based on the treaties. Legitimacy meant legally constituted political authority, a concept that assumed the exercise of good governance. Governments needed to be reconciled with their subjects, something they could achieve by taking account of public opinion and the people's aspirations when formulating policy. Governments also had a responsibility to procure the happiness of peoples and to augment public authority through moral force. The de facto existence of a government did not make it a legitimate government. In specific circumstances, based on practical philosophy or experience, as opposed to quote unquote beautiful theories, governments might conclude that legitimate authority depended on constitutions or representative bodies. Within the Russian Empire, the Polish Diet could be viewed as a model of moderate constitutionalism sanctioned from above, though one does have to remember that it never was fully implemented. In March 1818, at the opening of the Diet, Emperor Alexander declared, Emperor Alexander declared that liberal institutions were not by definition subversive. In appropriate conditions, liberal institutions were consistent with order and led to, quote, the true prosperity of nations. By contrast, liberty without morality and order, a reference to revolution, led to corruption. And distinguishing between ancient and modern institutions, Russia's diplomats did not bemoan change or equate modern development with revolution. As reported to Alexander in October 1820, revolution threatened, quote, with total ruin, the existence of all the states and all the institutions, old as well as modern, end quote. Political change, including the removal of despotic rulers, could be legitimate and might even be encouraged, but it should not come about through revolutionary or other violent means. When revolutions did occur, Russia's policymakers hoped for reconciliation between legitimate governments and their rebellious subjects or citizens. Russia's peacemakers consistently acknowledged that governments needed to be in alignment with the wishes of their peoples. Such language in no way represented a plea for democratic politics or a recognition of popular claim making. To the contrary, effective political authority depended on good governance, which deserved and received the moral support of people. From the Russian perspective, the conceptual novelty of Europe's restored order appeared in the deliberate and explicit attention accorded to the needs and wishes of the peoples, though again, without any reference to civil rights, the general will, or popular sovereignty. When in the second quarter of the 19th century, the Russian monarchy began to confront political and ideological opposition, the critical question would become, who speaks for the Russian people, the monarch, the state, or educated society? All right, turning now to my conclusions. The emphasis on moralistic sentiment in Russian peacemaking can seem disingenuous, especially in light of ongoing imperial expansion. But could there have been an alternative approach other than through the aspirational language of Christian morality and friendship among the sovereigns to overcome the dismay, distrust, and degradation of the Napoleonic era? Was there another mechanism or principle capable of holding together the allies who had ended the war and arrived at the peace? Was there a different way to sustain the seemingly endless effort required of the peacemakers as they worked to ensure the repose of Europe? In the face-to-face meetings of congresses and semi-permanent ministerial and ambassadorial conferences, the proclaimed sentiments of brotherhood and friendship among the sovereigns and their diplomats helped to soften the unavoidable disappointments and suspicions that arose from divergent interests, goals, and expectations. In conditions of violent upheaval and unequal power, personal bonds held out the hope of stability. The moral force of Allied unity, so often referenced in documents of Russian provenance, together with the moral settlement of the Holy Alliance, allowed Russia's diplomats and the Tsar diplomat to continue their work amid chronic crisis, uncertainty, and suspicion. The moral settlement allowed them to believe in the efficacy of their labors and the possibility of achieving a durable peace. Without such hope and a measure of abstract idealism to sustain it, the passage of the peoples from destructive war to creative peacemaking might not have been possible. Thank you for listening. And I apologize for my inept use of the PowerPoint.
Oh, not at all. No, no. There is nothing you need to apologize for. This was a delightful presentation. I think very topical, kind of in a sense of emphasizing the moral aspects of foreign policy. I do remind the participants that they to send their questions if they have any. I see that people are clapping, sort of virtual clapping to you, so thank you. Let me open the questioning part by asking, how much continuity do you see between the reigns of Russian rulers, because they are so different, right, in the period that we consider, or that you considered, from Catherine to Paul to Alexander to Nicholas, all of them very distinct personalities with different, I would even say, kind of ideological even approaches to it. So do we see continuity? What role do the personalities of the czars or tsarinas play?
Well, thank you for that question. So yes, I do. I really see the period from the reign of Peter until the great reforms of the 1860s, which follow the Crimean War. I see that those rulers as working within the same system. You know, even though, as you say, their personalities were very different, and you know, some of them, like Nicholas, is often regarded as reactionary and tyrannical. Paul, Peter was a tyrant, you know, compared to Catherine, who you tried to use persuasion and discussion in her methods of rule. But I really think that they all followed basically the same state building, military, you know, broad terms, and imperial policies, and their domestic policies were also similar. I mean, they were all reformists. You know, all the significant rulers were interested in political reform, and even Nicholas I, about whom I don't say anything in this presentation, but he's part of this period that the conference is concerned about. I mean, he was also, you know, interested in reform and preparing for reform. So, you know, this model of reform from above, absolutist authority, and, you know, the foundations of serfdom, the foundations of society in serfdom and in the peasant economy, all of that continues. And then we get a break, you know, with the great reforms. But I still think the political culture really, even though there will be new dimensions to it with the emergence of you know, independent educated classes and new socioeconomic classes, at the very apex, that political culture survives. And you could say it survives really until the end of the old regime in 1917.
Maybe as a quick follow-up, one of the questions that was asked was, what about the role, you know, that, you know, as Patricia Grimstead demonstrated in her work, that there was a lot of personal factors rather than necessarily institutional, ideological, in the Russian diplomacy. So what's the role of the foreign ministers in shaping this political culture?
Well, you know, I mean, there's a lot of influence that different ministers, not just foreign ministers, can have, you know, and depending on the specific situation and the specific policy, there are differences. So there's you know, the movement away from France, right? Or at the end of the 18th century, which, you know, I guess for obvious reasons in some ways, but there still are within the diplomatic community people who support a stronger alliance with France. You know, so those alliance preferences you can see in the sources I looked at still, but you know, in this system, it's the monarch who decides. And so I'm a little skeptical when I read, you know, when I read histories of this period and I read about how this or that person influenced Alexander, or how Metternich, you know, persuaded him to move away from his liberalism. I don't buy those arguments, because Alexander knew what he was doing. He, you know, I don't think anyone could influence a monarch such as Alexander, who was so active in so many areas in a decisive way. You know, it may be in a particular situation, but a lot of what we read about Alexander is about expectations of Alexander and not about who he really was. So,
well, as a follow-up, and I'm delighted to see that Dr. Janet Hartley is with us, and she asked, do you think that the slow development of what has been called as legal consciousness, and this is quotation mark, legal consciousness, in Russia contributes to the nature of Russian diplomacy and makes it more personal to the czars?
I think, you know, Janet and we overlap a lot in our work, and we talk a lot. Thank you, Janet, for the question and for being here. Yes, I would say yes, that, you know, and I don't want to, there's a big debate in Russian history about legal consciousness, and you know, there's a lot of informal, and the way I like to describe it is the difference between formal law and informal law. So, you know, and as I mentioned in the paper, it's not that we're talking about lawlessness, you know, when we're talking about high-level policymakers or rulers. We're just talking about a system where the ruler, in rendering any kind of administrative or judicial decision, and those decisions work their way up to the ruler, he or she can change the law at will. So some people find contradictory, you know, there's a lot in this period. Alexander is very focused, and his diplomats are very focused on adherence to the legal treaties. But there's also in the Russian political culture this emphasis on outcomes, you know, what we would call just outcomes. So you know, that's why all this discussion about the spirit of the law, you know, or the moral spirit, you know, some of these phrases and concepts that people find nebulous and maybe even erratic, they're related to this view of law, where we're not just talking about observing the law or observing the treaties. We're talking about justice, and you know, the law is flexible, and the law is supposed to achieve justice. And so if that means you have to change the law in the process of achieving justice, then that's part of the system. So I'm not sure I answered her question. I kind of lost track of the wording.
Again, let me ask the audience to send the questions in the chat, so we can continue this discussion. What is, again, you touched upon the issue of religion. Do you see that factor increasing in the post-Napoleonic period?
Now that's a very, you mean for Alexander? I mean,
and then after, yeah, exactly, and then after him.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a lot of discussions too. I mean, this would be one of the differences between rulers that you mentioned. You know, I mean, did Catherine really believe in orthodoxy? You know, that sort of thing. I think that the religious belief is fundamental, that it's there throughout. And I think I guess when I started working on these sources, one of the things that struck me, and I tried to touch on that in the presentation, was how did they keep going? I mean, after 20 plus years of vicious warfare, and I mean the strength that it took to keep it together, to just engage in this diplomacy, and I just found that amazing over and over again. How did they find the strength, to just keep at it? And so, my view of Alexander is that he was a genuine believer there. I've written about the religious enlightenment in late 18th century Russia. And I think, that the religious enlightenment was a pan-European phenomenon. So it wasn't unique to Russia. And, I'm interested in how religion becomes modern, how it continues to evolve and remain relevant. And, maybe that's also an American perspective in contrast to a European perspective. We're always seen as having these connections to religion that other peoples may not have. But so, I mean, I don't see any contradiction, between these traditional religious beliefs, which I think in the Russian religious enlightenment had an ecumenical quality. Russian Orthodoxy is not doctrinaire in the way that Catholicism is, or even Protestantism. The dogma, it's more the experience of religion than the actual dogma. So that fits with the Russian legal culture that's come up, with the kind of lack of definition or the open-endedness of it. And so, the more or less religious, I just think the religious identification and the way of experiencing religion in one's life changes. And there's a flexibility, I think, in the Russian religious culture that allows for an enlightened ruler such as Alexander to find solace and strength in the church. I was struck by this. It's funny, since this is Utrecht, right? And I went to a conference. It had to do with the Social Science Institute in Amsterdam, and there was an exhibit. The Hermitage in Amsterdam. There was an exhibit of Alexander's his portable iconostasis. The iconostasis that he carried around in the field. When he was going wherever he was going all over Europe. And, that I found that exhibit very striking. All the implements were there, the images were there, and it was carried around, it had to be there. So.
Well, on this connection with Utrecht, I want to extend my deep gratitude to you for delivering such a wonderful keynote address, and again convey my sincerest condolences on your personal loss. I want to bring Beatrice, who bravely, despite feeling a little bit under weather, has stayed with us so late. Beatrice, any concluding remarks?
No, I've been so much enjoying your lecture, Elise, and I cannot help, of course, in building bridges to what we see happening today, and this ingrained religious, the moral dimension of international relations and politics. So your lecture was wonderful and really illuminating. So thank you so much, Elise.
Thank you, and you feel better.
Thank you so much for sticking with us. Beatrice and I will hopefully see you tomorrow for Saturday, full day of panels, discussions, and of course, wonderful keynote address at the end of it. Have a wonderful night. Have a wonderful rest of the day for those who are in the United States, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.